Hello and welcome to another episode of Straight Talk with me, Tom Reed, Head of Oil Market Analysis here at Argus, and I am delighted to welcome back to the show John Ollett, our Head of EMEA Freight, as well as Nader Itayim, who heads our Dubai editorial department, to talk about the latest twists and turns in the Hormuz saga. Hormuz 2.0. Scary thought, gentlemen, but if this were an iPhone, it would be the second of 50 models. Just saying. What has happened since we last spoke? Well, I went on holiday and that was lovely, but I have got back to the apparent closure of the Bab el Mandeb Strait, which is less lovely. Houthi militants, apparently at Tehran's behest, have threatened to sink Saudi ships attempting passage of the Red Sea's Bab el Mandeb Strait. And just for context, Saudi Arabia niftily shifted about 4.5 million barrels a day of its exports from the Strait of Hormuz to the Red Sea in April after Iran shut down Hormuz. This effectively means that if Saudi wants to send oil to Asia, it's got to reroute those cargoes north now through the Suez Canal and sail them round the Cape of Good Hope to reach Asia. How have oil markets reacted? Physical dated last night. This is the 21st of July. Punching back above $90. Backwardation in sweet crude markets is roaring higher. And the premium of Brent to Dubai is now more than $9 a barrel. Dubai itself, relatively weak, presumably because Iran has begun targeting a bunch of ships again, including Kuwaiti and UAE vessels attempting to transit Hormuz. And as a result, ship owners really don't want to go there. Demand, it seems, will transfer from the Middle East Gulf to the Atlantic Basin. And it's probably reasonable to infer that's why we see the strength materializing in the Brent complex instead of in Dubai. So, gentlemen, any holidays planned?
Not anymore.
I do. Wish me luck.
Yeah, good luck. Hope you booked them early. Okay, John, we know about Hormuz. Hormuz isn't great. How bad's the Red Sea?
So it's not good and getting worse, I think we can say. A couple of days ago, the Yemen-based Houthi militants imposed a maritime ban on Saudi Arabia. Now, they have been light on the details, describing it as a siege for a siege, an eye for an eye, but they have very specifically said a maritime ban on Saudi Arabia. Where they have been non-specific is they haven't said whether it's Saudi cargoes or only Saudi ships or ships that have called at Saudi ports, but it appears that after an initial pause in the markets for a few hours, ships are starting to turn around. Yesterday, we had at least 5 ships turn around. Now, some of them were coming westbound and empty, destined for Yanbu, but we've also had 2 coming out of Yanbu, loaded, that were moving towards the Bab el Mandeb Strait and have turned around. So this is a significant problem. The last ship that we had go through was just around the time of the Houthis' announcement. That was a Greek-owned tanker carrying Saudi crude, and it was the last ship to go through, I think, on the 20th of July, sometime in the early morning. And since then, no more Saudi-linked ships are going through. One caveat with this, there are 3 key flows that go through the Bab el Mandeb Strait. The first one, of course, is the Saudi crude coming out of their Red Sea ports, not just Yanbu, but the other ports on that coast. They usually come through, it's normally VLCCs, normally going to East Asia, the majority going to Japan, China, South Korea, some going to India. We're talking about 3 million barrels a day, roughly. That gets exported from Yanbu and goes through. The rest of the Yanbu material goes into the Sumed pipeline and comes into Europe. The other key flow, of course, is Russian crude. Russian crude at the moment is unaffected, and during the last set of Houthi issues, let's say, Russian crude was also mostly unaffected, although occasionally there were still accidental strikes on Russian vessels. And then the third flow is the other direction. So all of these flows are north to south. We also have south to north, mostly Indian products coming into Europe. There have been at least 1, possibly 2 tankers that have gone through since the Houthi ban, carrying West Coast Indian products destined for Europe. So that flow is continuing. The Russian flow is continuing. So there are still a lot of vessels moving through the Bab el Mandeb Strait. But it appears those that are Saudi linked, either by heading to Yanbu, coming through from Yanbu, or being owned by Saudi Arabia, those ships are starting to show some serious hesitancy.
That, I suppose, I mean, I don't want to seem like a kind of a, hand glossy and optimist here, but it sounds like the situation could be worse. Obviously, it's not great, but if you have oil still moving, that is, I guess, something.
It would be
Jonathan,
worth adding to that of course the 𝘗 ports are within range of potential Houthi attacks. So the Houthis use small boats, they use drones, they use missiles, and they're all within range of the Saudi ports. So as you say, it could be worse. There is definite room for escalation here.
yeah, yeah. I mean, just to focus on that Saudi issue for a second, of course, when crude's trading on a spot basis, it can discount dynamically to absorb sudden changes in freight costs. In theory, I mean, that's not how Saudi Arabia worked or has worked historically. They've already fixed their official prices for cargoes loading this month. They can't just discount them to offset the increase in the freight cost. So how much extra in freight terms would this add if you're a refiner in Asia to the cost of moving a cargo north from Yanbu via Suez, round the Cape of Good Hope and onto Asia?
So in short, a fairly large amount of money. So in order for a Yanbu cargo to go through the Suez and go all the way to, let's take Qingdao in China as example, we're talking about nearly a 30-day additional voyage time, which is a lot of money. So a VLCC burns on average sort of 65 tons a day. If you work that out using the current Singapore bunker price, which is, $745 a ton roughly, we're talking about $1.4 million additional cost in fuel alone. That's just the fuel. You add into that the hire of the vessel, a non-Mideast Gulf VLCC. So let's take, for example, a sample of West Africa to China. That's currently $95,000 a day to hire the ship. So that's sticking on another, $2.5–3 million in ship hire costs. And of course, on top of that, you then have the Suez Canal fee, and laden VLCCs, which is mostly what comes out of Yanbu, does not go through the Suez Canal. You have to offload part of the cargo into the Sumed pipeline, go through the Suez Canal and pick it up again. So let's take, say, $500,000 for that cost, and that is, we are talking lowball estimates here, because we're also using current bunker prices, and if the price of crude shoots up, there too will follow bunkers. So if you basically crunch all those numbers together, you get about $17 to $18 a ton, or about $2.40 a barrel. That's quite a lot of money, and that is assuming ceteris paribus, there are no issues. As in, the bunker price is not going to go up, the shipping cost is not going to go up, and of course, those things are going to go up. The one step that we've seen a ship owner and charterer take at the moment, so a South Korean exporter from the region was looking for a ship, and they added into their bid on the market saying, at charterer's discretion, or if the Bab el Mandeb Strait is closed, diversion round the Cape of Good Hope through Suez Canal, costs to be sorted out later. So that is what they were doing yesterday. Now, whether it is as simple as that, because costs to be sorted out later, fair enough, but the cost is still going to have to be paid and still going to have to be included and taken into account. And then, of course, there's a debate as to, we haven't seen any ship owner accept that particular clause yet. But that is the first stage of what we have seen. So it is a large amount of money.
And a punitive, yeah. That is going to be a major concern, I guess, to refiners in Asia, with the possible exception of China, which has, of course, been drastically cutting its purchases from Saudi Arabia because they have been scaling back demand. Nader, I think there was a view that Houthi militants have become less militant. Clearly, that risk was mispriced, misrecognized. What has persuaded them to throw their lot in with Iran, if indeed that's what's going on?
Yeah, so largely I'd say yes, that is what's going on. I think, look, if we look at the backstory just briefly, I mean, the Houthis had been locked in this war with Riyadh as part of the, the Saudi-led coalition for about 11 to 12 years. The Saudis, obviously, they have an incredible military, sophisticated military. They've invested heavily in it, substantial air force. So they had been bombing the Houthis for many, many years, and they bombed them until around, I think for about 7 of the last 11 years, they've been bombing them until about 2022. And then at that point, there was a ceasefire agreed between Saudi and the Houthis. It wasn't perfect, I mean, to say the least, but a ceasefire nonetheless. Now, the Houthi links, obviously, to Iran, they're very well known. No matter who we talk to, I think everyone will sort of assess the strength of that relationship differently. That is, essentially to what extent the Houthis are autonomous and to what extent they are, taking their marching orders from Tehran. So I think given what was happening between the US and Iran, there was always, a question in people's minds, when are the Houthis going to get involved? Could they get involved? That threat was always there. So essentially, over the first few months, what we saw, the Houthis had sat on the sidelines. They had only, I think, launched maybe 1 or 2 missiles or drones at Israel in this time. In essence, I think they were sort of waiting until they were needed. And by needed, I mean, by Iran, by the IRGC, Tehran in general. And it seems like today, Tehran is sort of anticipating a potentially more aggressive campaign stance or posture by the Trump administration. So I think they essentially felt deterrence was needed. And they thought, now is the time. Now is the time to deploy. Now is the time for the Houthis to be making some noise, begin to cause some trouble. And what better way to do that by, or to get attention rather of the US by tormenting one of the US's main allies in the region, in Saudi Arabia, threaten shipping.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that really interests me is the asymmetry of this response, because of course, last month when it all kicked off again, you had a lot of GCC countries respond with kind of air attacks on Iran, with the notable exception of Saudi, who didn't. And yet that has not protected them from this, from being pulled into this conflict by the Houthis.
There was some, I mean, I can't say I can confirm it, but there has been some reports suggesting that, Saudi Arabia did take part in limited way. The UAE took part in a limited way. I think there might have been others as well, possibly Kuwait, I'm not entirely sure. But so, I mean, it's not that they didn't get involved in a direct way. And I think it's fair to say when the war began, all of the Gulf countries insisted that the US does not use any of their bases and they want to stay out of it. And it only after, they started getting dragged into this and started getting targeted by Iran did some of these bases become a little bit more active in their participation in the launches and the strikes against Iran. So this is the thing, and throughout all of this, even over the last 2 weeks, we have seen, parties to the, diplomatic effort with Iran even getting targeted, albeit, to a lesser degree, but still, the likes of Qatar, the likes of Oman, these are massive players in this kind of area right now, and yet even they have been drawn in. So essentially, I think this is where we are. One thing I wanted to point out is. We were talking about escalation with John. I think it's interesting for me, at least, that the Houthis, it seems, in the way that they have come with this announcement, they have left some room for escalation. That is, yes, what the Houthis were doing prior in 2023 to 25, it was more of a broad kind of blockade in the sense that they would be targeting a wide array of vessels, although they would claim at times that it was only Israeli linked. I think they didn't do very well in terms of identifying which were and which were not Israeli linked. Right now, they're focusing on Saudi vessels in a way. We're not entirely sure, but in theory, if they need to, if Iran calls on them to, they could up the ante and essentially say, what, we're going from a blockade on Saudi Arabia to a full blockade. So I mean, escalation exists, and there's a very high risk of that happening potentially. If that's where, if Iran feels that it's going to be cornered, I think that's when you could see the Bab el Mandeb sort of front and open up even more.
I think that issue of the Saudi shipping is kind of one worth just pausing on. John, it's obviously worth noting that, as we just mentioned, Saudi Arabia has shown slightly more flexibility in terms of how it markets its crude, including selling 1 or 2 cargoes delivered on a spot basis just during the last Hormuz 1.0. If Aramco were willing to absorb those additional freight costs, how capable is it of moving crude on its own tankers, where it could consider maybe freight as a sunk cost? Does it have the ships? Is that something that it is capable of doing? Because, of course, these will be targets for the Houthis.
So Bahri is the Saudi Arabian national tanker carrier. They do have a very, very large number of ships. Can it use those exclusively for Yanbu? Possibly not. It is a lot of material that is coming out of Yanbu, about 3 million barrels a day going through the Bab el Mandeb Strait that will have to be redirected. Of course, every time that a journey on average gets longer, that means the ship is occupied for longer, so it is harder and takes longer to get it back in order to pick up its next cargo. They already have a lot of established cargoes for Bahri, like established deals that they've already got to carry that they can't just break. Bahri also operates in the spot market where it feels its revenues are strongest. And in addition to that, we saw earlier that there are kind of three key costs here: the bunker fuel, the Suez Canal fee, and the ship owner cost. So even on a Bahri deal, first of all, it's a big loss for Bahri because they could be getting a contract at $95,000 a day. And if they instead get paid kind of a more standard $20,000 a day, that's a lot of lost revenue for them. And in addition, you're not going to get away from the bunker fuel cost, and you're not going to get away from the Suez Canal cost, which Saudi Arabia does not control. And so they are still going to have a substantial increase in costs there, regardless of what they do.
Yeah, I mean, the opportunity cost, that's a kind of really interesting element to consider in the whole Bahri dynamic. Yeah, clearly going to be a big problem. Okay, so Nader, when this all kicked off again, Monday, I guess it was, US President Donald Trump said, "We take care of things. If something like that happens, we will take care of it." He was, of course, referring to the Houthi blockade of the Bab el Mandeb. But can he take care of it? What are his options here?
The thing is, I mean, we had a period, I think it was last year, where essentially, the U.S. tried to go after the Houthis, and they did engage in a fairly, I mean, it was a short-term kind of engagement. There was a bombing campaign against the Yemenis, since the Houthis rather, for a few weeks, and although it was a significant bombing campaign, it didn't really achieve that much. Ultimately, yes, there were some, elements of the Houthi leadership that were eliminated, but ultimately it didn't really stop the Houthis' ability to target vessels or to fight back, in essence. And I think even a couple of days after that particular round of bombing ended, I think that the Houthis actually targeted a vessel within 2-3 days of that happening. So what we see today is that although they continue to be, bombed every so often, the Houthis always seem to find a way of finding their feet. They always land on their feet. So are they getting stronger over this period? Let's say in the last 10 years, they have come under a fair, attack on a fair few occasions. And I think today, unlike, let's say, another of Iran's proxies, the Hezbollah, who has been degraded significantly over the last 2-3 years because of their involvement in the situation with Israel and the bomb by Israel, the Houthis really have not been degraded in that sense. They have still been there. They still continue to be a nuisance. And,
I mean, let's not forget, they pioneered this whole model of warfare.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that doesn't all go well. But, of course, the US has reinstated its blockade of Iran, and there is a serious economic cost to that to Iran. What is the mood in Iran? Are there voices inside the regime calling for a return to diplomacy? And how influential are they?
Yeah, I mean, just to pull back to the last question, that essentially, I think it all gets pulled back to what's going on with Iran. So thank you for asking the question. I think, look, coming into this week, it did feel, at least over the weekend, that there was a bit of a turn. There was suddenly a shift in the rhetoric or the noises essentially coming out of both Iran and the US. You would have the Secretary of State Rubio talking about negotiations and, we want to do this, we want diplomacy, but it depends on Iran, so on and so forth. On the Iranian side, you had confirmation from them that there are, the mediators are working and there are proposals that are coming their way. Iran's Interior Minister was in Pakistan, I think yesterday or earlier this week for talks with them. Obviously, Pakistan being one of the two main mediators of this, conflict of the last few months, alongside Qatar and Oman. So those wheels are definitely in motion. But the thing is, as I've probably pointed out in earlier episodes, um, now this particular conflict, rather, with now what's happening in the in Red Strait and Bab el Mandeb, with every single day, this conflict widens. And with that widening, it becomes more and more difficult, essentially, to contain this. All right. Now, Iran and the US continue, despite everything, to feel that neither are losing, neither has to essentially go and give up further concessions. And the one important thing here, I think, is that Iran essentially feels it has time on its side, or at least more time than the US does, given the impact on the global economy, the impact on the oil price, so on and so forth. Especially as inventories continue to be drawn and supplies from the region continue to be blocked in. So Iran feels it has less to lose, and I think, and we even heard that from the military side of the leadership. So I think this is unfortunately where we are. I think ultimately Trump, the U.S. administration, if they do come back to the table to sort of engage another round of diplomacy, there has to be an acceptance and an understanding that unfortunately the Strait of Hormuz, which has become the top element on the ticket, the top of the list, I personally do not see a way in which Iran is going to give this leverage up in the way that the US wants it to. That is, to basically have the US say loudly and openly, Iran, give this up, lose it. I think ultimately, Trump has two really bad options in front of him. One is to obviously continue to fight and try and bomb the Strait of Hormuz open. That's not really going to work. Alternatively, maybe come up with some kind of a solution where Iran does at least get some kind of symbolic control, which would essentially validate Iran's course of actions. So there's two bad options in front of him, but I think ultimately the latter is going to be the way that we ultimately get out of this, be it today, tomorrow, or in 6 months' time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we called this episode From Bab to Worse. My pun. I thought it was a very good one.
It's very
So we're now 2 straits down. I was amused and slightly, ironically, not in a happy way, to read that the U.S. administration had carried out a survey of choke points in 2025. One can only wonder what they learned from that survey. John, are there any other choke points that we might be podcasting about?
Well, it's funny that you should mention that, because in addition to Hormuz and the Bab el Mandeb Strait, we are now having problems in the Panama Canal, not to mention also the Black Sea and the Bosphorus. So the Panama Canal is not affected by water conflict, as the others are, but instead by the weather and the El Nino weather phenomenon, which leads to very hot weather, and the level of water in the artificial lake, the Gatun that feeds the Panama Canal, drops, meaning that there is less water available for the Panama Canal to pump into the locks to move the ships up and down and over the mountain. So they have now cancelled the spot daily auctions for the Panamax locks, so not the Neo-Panamax yet. However, they have already cut the available water expectations for the Neo-Panamax locks. The long-term auctions are still in place, but 70% of the traffic that uses the Panama Canal uses these Panamax locks. And it's essentially going to shave, they're estimating, at least 2 ships a day off the total transits, which doesn't necessarily sound like a lot, going from 36 to 34, but is actually, when it builds up over the course of the week, that's 14 ships that are no longer going and now have to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope instead. And impacts on the Panama Canal are exponential, because the additional time that they have to spend going around the Cape of Good Hope and coming back around the Cape of Good Hope is significant. The last time
these are ships that will primarily be going into the United States, are they?
They tend to return empty to the United States and go laden to Asia. So LPG is one of the big ones that gets affected.
Yeah.
Container ships are not so affected because they tend to be first on the priority list, but we'll especially see it on LPG, which has already lost those Mideast Gulf volumes, and now is relying almost solely on US volumes that will now struggle more to go through the Panama Canal. And this is just the effect now. It looks like the Panama Canal Authority is trying to kind of get ahead of the Gatun Lake problems that it knows are coming. So this is where we are in July. Let's see where we are in September. We could be looking at further cuts through the course of August. There's going to be another cut to the Neo-Panamax locks in August that they've already announced. And then there's all the stuff that, that they haven't announced yet, that they may have to as the weather continues to worsen.
Yeah, that is potentially very price supportive for oil, inflationary globally, when you think that, a lot of Asia and China in particular have been sort of trying to resolve the naphtha shortages from the Middle East by taking more LPG and ethane from the United States. That's where all our plastics come from. Yeah, pretty worrying sign that. Okay, on that,
just to add, so just to add, pre-US-Iran situation, the highest LPG freights we ever saw were 2023, on record for August. 2023, the last time that there were significant problems in the Panama Canal. It put it up over $100 a ton. And if we're already above that because of the US-Iran war, you don't want to stick another $100 a ton on top of that.
You absolutely do not. Right. On that slightly ominous note, that is all we have time for. Guys, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me. For those that are listening, please tune in again next week. And in the meantime, as ever, for all your news, pricing, analysis needs, check out argusmedia.com. Thank you all very much and goodbye.